The dog found a bleeding alien, then the human did something unthinkable, asterisk. The night was cold and silent, and the snow fell like soft feathers from the sky and covered everything in white and quiet, and the only sound was the wind moving slowly through the trees and the crack of frozen branches in the distance, and Cole sat by the fire in his small wooden cabin deep in the forest with his dog, Bryn, sleeping by his feet, and the warmth from the flames was the only thing keeping the chill away, and Cole closed his eyes for just a moment to rest when Bryn suddenly lifted his head and let out a low growl that grew louder and sharper, and then the dog stood up and barked with his fur standing on end, and ran to the door and scratched it with panic in his voice. Cole opened his eyes fast and jumped to his feet and grabbed his coat and flashlight and opened the door to find Bryn already dashing into the trees with snow flying behind him, and Cole called his name once, twice, 3 times, but the dog did not stop, and Cole knew something was wrong, and he followed the trail of paw prints in the snow with the light shaking in his hand and his boots crunching against the frozen ground. The forest at night was dark and thick and full of shapes and shadows, and each step Cole took made his breath turn white in the air, and the cold bit through his gloves. But he kept walking because Bryn never barked like that without a reason. And then he saw it, a splash of glowing blue in the snow, like paint spilled in the whiteness, and he crouched to look and touched it with his glove, and it felt warm and thick and sticky. Like blood but not human. Cole followed the trail of glowing drops that led deeper into the trees, and his heart pounded faster as the light showed broken branches and drag marks in the snow, like someone or something had crawled or been pulled through the forest. And then he saw Bryn standing still, with his ears flat and his eyes locked on something ahead, and Cole raised his flashlight slowly, and the beam stopped on a shape in the snow. It was small and curled and shaking and covered in some kind of suit or skin that shimmered under the light, and Cole stepped closer and saw the being breathing hard and bleeding from the side and trying to pull itself away with no strength left. And then it looked at him, and its eyes were wide and glowing and full of fear and pain and confusion, and it tried to speak but only coughed and gasped, and then it collapsed again into the snow. Bryn took one careful step forward and sniffed the alien, then looked back at Cole, as if asking what now, and Cole felt frozen inside, not from the cold but from the sight before him, because he had heard stories of aliens and wars and broken peace and dangerous creatures hiding from patrols and hunters, but he had never seen one so close, so real, so hurt. The alien was a girl, or at least looked like one, with small thin arms and a face that showed pain like any human would, and her breathing was slow and rough, and her fingers twitched as she tried to grab something in the snow. A small glowing stone now cracked and fading, and Cole knew she had nothing left. No fight, no energy, no hope. Bryn moved closer and licked her hand gently, and the alien did not pull away. Instead, her lips moved, and she said something weak and soft in a language Cole did not understand, but the tone was clear. It was not anger or threat, it was fear, and maybe even a plea. Cole stood in silence, with the wind howling above, and the snow falling on his coat, and the flashlight flickering in his hand, and he thought of all the things he could do: walk away, leave her here, report it to someone, let nature finish the job, or do something else, something that made no sense, something that might change everything. Bryn looked up at him with eyes that asked a question without words, and Cole sighed and took a deep breath and walked forward and knelt beside the alien girl and carefully lifted her from the snow, and she moaned but did not resist, and her body was cold but still alive, and her blue blood stained his jacket and gloves, and he turned back toward the cabin with Bryn leading the way, and each step felt heavy, like walking into a future he did not understand. Behind him, the snow covered the glowing trail, and the forest returned to silence and darkness as if hiding what had just happened, and the night watched as one human did something unthinkable, not out of duty, not out of fear, but out of something else, something older and deeper than any war or law, something that even the stars could not explain. And so the dog, the human, and the wounded alien girl vanished into the trees with only the wind to remember their path through the snow. Asterisk. The storm hit harder as Cole carried the bleeding alien through the forest, and snow slapped his face and the cold stabbed through his jacket, and Bryn stayed close to his heels, growling low, as if he felt unseen eyes behind the trees, and every step felt longer, every breath sharper, and Cole's arms burned from the weight. But he did not stop, because something deep in him refused to leave her behind. The cabin came into view, like a ghost rising in the dark, and Cole kicked open the door and rushed inside, and later on the old couch near the fire, and Bryn ran in circles once, then stood guard at the door, and Cole locked it fast, and dropped to his knees beside the alien girl, and her skin was like ice, and her lips moved but no sound came, and her side was still bleeding, glowing blue that stained the cushions. Cole grabbed the first aid kit from the wall and tore open packs of gauze and sealed gel, and began to clean her wound without knowing if it would work, and he had never treated anything like this before, and her blood hissed when it touched the cloth, and her breathing hitched with each touch, but she never opened her eyes. He tried not to stare at her face, but he could not help it. Her features were strange, yet soft, her hair a mix of silver and blue strands that curled around her neck, and her jaw was bruised, and her hands had strange metal rings half melted into her skin, as if someone had tried to control her, chain her, or worse, and Cole's jaw tightened with anger. Though he had no idea why, Bryn sniffed her boot and whimpered softly, and then walked to the fire and laid down, but his eyes never left her, and Cole wrapped the blanket around her and added more wood to the flames, and the heat filled the small room, and made the shadows dance across the walls like old memories. Returning from the cold hours passed, and she did not wake, and the snow outside fell heavier, until the cabin looked buried, and Cole sat in the old wooden chair across from her, and watched every breath she took, and thought about everything that had led to this moment. And none of it made sense. He had come here to disappear, to live alone, to forget the world and its wars. And now a wounded alien lay under his roof, and his dog had brought her, and he had chosen to carry her inside when he could have walked away and left her to the ice like so many others would have done. His radio buzzed once in the corner, and he turned to look at it, and then looked back at her, and he walked over and pressed the button, and a voice crackled through static, saying, "Unknown life form detected, sector for moving west, possible contact, repeat possible contact." Cole turned the volume down and stared at the glowing green light on the radio, and his finger hovered over the transmit button, and Bryn lifted his head and stared at him, and the choice sat heavy in the room, like a weight pressing down on all three of them, and Cole lowered his hand and turned the radio off. He walked back to her, and sat again and watched her chest rise and fall slowly, and he thought maybe she was a scout or a spy, or a runaway, or something worse, and maybe tomorrow the sky would open and ships would fall, and fire would rain from above. But in this moment all he saw was a girl, half dead and cold, and no one should die like that. Bryn stood up and walked over to the couch, and placed his head gently on her knee, and did not move, and Cole smiled a little, though it faded quick, and he whispered to the dog, "So what did we just get into, old friend?" And Bryn wagged his tail once, and kept his head on her leg. With a fire popped, and the wind howled outside, and the night stretched long and heavy, and Cole leaned back in the chair, and stared at the ceiling, and tried not to imagine the sound of engines in the sky, or footsteps in the snow, or the kind of men who chased someone until she bled blue in the forest, and collapsed with no name, and no help. Then she stirred a little, and her fingers curled around the blanket, and her lips moved again with no sound, and Cole leaned forward and watched as her eyes fluttered but did not open, and a small tear slid from the corner of her eye and vanished into the warmth of the cloth hand. In that small moment Cole felt something shift inside him, not just pity, not just duty, something deeper, something dangerous, something human, and he knew this was not just a stranger on his couch. This was the beginning of something bigger than he had ever wanted, something that would not stop at his door outside. The snow kept falling, and the stars above were hidden, and the world was quiet, except for the breathing of three souls, now tied together by something neither war nor fate could break. The cabin was quiet, and the fire burned low, and Cole sat near the edge of the bed with Bryn resting beside him, and the alien girl breathing soft but steady under a thick blanket, and snow still clung to her strange suit, and her wounds had stopped bleeding, but her skin looked pale and weak, and Cole had wrapped her ribs with clean cloth and placed water and food beside her, though she had not yet moved or opened her eyes. Since he brought her in from the cold, he stared at her, unsure what to do next, and thoughts swirled in his mind faster than the wind outside. What if she was dangerous? What if others were looking for her? What if they were already coming? And then her fingers twitched, and her head turned, and her eyes opened slow, and glowing with a soft blue light like frozen moons trapped behind glass, and Cole froze as those eyes locked onto his. She did not scream. She did not fight. She only blinked slow and tried to speak, but no words came, just dry air and sharp pain. And then her body curled in fear, and she whispered one sound, something soft, something broken, something strange, and Cole leaned closer to hear it again and again. She tried until the word formed clearly, in a low voice, not human, but close enough to understand. "Please." Bryn wagged his tail once, and licked her hand, and she did not pull away, and her lips moved again, but this time the words were longer still, broken but smoother, like they were rising from memory, not habit, and she said, "Danger, not safe, no light," and her eyes looked at the window like she feared the shadows there. Cole asked her name, and she paused and said it slow, like it hurt to speak. "Zira," and he repeated it once, and she nodded weakly, and then said another name, not her own. but something else, a place or maybe a person, and then she reached for her side and winced in pain as her body tried to move, and Cole helped her sit against the walls. Sarah took the cup of water and drank only a little, then coughed and pointed to the door, her voice shaky and soft, but the message clear: they will come, they smell me, they track. And Cole asked, who are they? But she only shook her head, and her eyes filled with fear, not just of them, but of something deeper, something broken in her past that words could not hold. Bryn growled low and walked to the door, and Cole followed with his hand on the old rifle hanging near the window, and he looked outside, but saw nothing, only snow and trees, and long shadows dancing in the wind. But his gut told him she was not wrong. Someone would come, something had already begun. He returned to her side and sat and asked why she was here, why she was alone and bleeding in the woods, and she said escape in the dark, taken hurt, broken, not weapon, not tool. And Cole did not understand at first, but then it clicked in his mind like an old key turning in a frozen lock. She had not been a soldier, she had been a prisoner, something used, not someone free. Zira looked at Bryn, then at Cole, and whispered, you help, why? And Cole had no answer, only a heavy breath and a tired heart, and he said, you were hurt, what else could I do? And she looked at him for a long time, as if searching for something behind his face, some truth she had not seen before in her life. Suddenly, a flash of light filled the cabin, as a drone passed by overhead, and Zira dove from the bed, with a gasp, and crawled under the table, shaking, and Cole rushed to the window, and saw the small black machine scan the ground and vanish into the sky again, and Bryn barked once and then went quiet, as if sensing something big had changed. Cole turned and found Zira, still shaking, her hands tight around the chair leg, and her eyes wide with panic, and he spoke soft, telling her it was gone, telling her she was safe for now. And she looked at him and whispered again, you should leave me, and he shook his head and said, not happening. She looked at the old radio on the shelf and said, signal calls them, kill all, and Cole walked to it and stared for a moment before slowly unplugging the power and tossing it into the drawer, and he looked at her and said, no more calls, not unless you want to. And Zira stared as if no one had ever given her that choice. Before night came again, and the fire burned quiet, and the three sat close together in silence. One human, one dog, one broken alien girl, and outside the snow kept falling, and the stars above watched without a sound as something new began inside that small wooden cabin. Something strange and soft and powerful, something the galaxy would never expect and never forget. Morning came slow and gray, and Cole stood by the window staring at the forest with a mug in his hand that had long gone cold, and Bryn sat beside the couch where Zero still lay sleeping, and the snow outside had softened everything, like the world wanted to forget what had happened the night before. But Cole could not forget because he had seen too much, and now he needed. And Shira opened her eyes as the fire popped and cracked, and she blinked at the ceiling for a long moment before she tried to sit, and Cole rushed over and helped her gently. And she did not pull away, and that small thing told him she was beginning to trust him, even if she did not say it. She said a few words in her own language, then switched slowly to broken human tongue, asking water, asking food, and Cole brought both, and sat near her, and asked again, who hurt you, and why were you alone in the woods? And she went quiet, and her eyes moved to the fire, and her fingers trembled as she pulled back the blanket and turned away from him, and slowly pulled down the top of her suit. Just enough to show her back. Cole stepped closer and froze when he saw the marks burned into her skin, not tattoos, not wounds from battle, but something else, deep cuts in shapes he did not understand, patterns that glowed faintly even in the dim light, and his stomach turned cold because these were not scars of war. They were Brand's marks of ownership, marks of controls. Ira whispered one word, and it hit him like a brick. Lab, and then another, not soldier, and then more test clone code failure, and the words poured from her like poison from a cracked bottle. And Cole listened without speaking because now he understood. She had not escaped from war, she had escaped from something far worse. He asked softly who did this, and she said a name, one he did not know, but the way she said it, with hate and fear, made him feel like he should. And then she looked at him and asked again, why did you help me? And he had no answer, just silence and the sound of Bryn breathing beside them. Zira reached into her suit and pulled out a tiny shard of glass-like metal and handed it to him and said, this was inside me, and it tracked me and hurt me and kept me asleep. And Cole held it in his hand and felt heat pulsing from it, and knew this was not human tech, and knew he had just stepped deeper into something with no way out. He walked to the corner of the room where the old toolbox sat, and dug out a small scanner left over from his time in the outpost, and powered it on, and held it over the shard, and numbers and symbols filled the screen faster than he could read them, and the last line froze his breath. Unknown tech tagged asset level red, terminate on site. He looked at Zero, and saw her watching him like a cornered animal who had stopped running but still waited for the final blow, and he felt anger rise in his chest, not at her, not at the world, but at the thing that made her feel like she deserved to be hunted and erased. She tried to stand, but her legs were weak, and Cole helped her again, and she held onto his shoulder and whispered, "Thank you, not just for help, but for not turning away." And he nodded and said quietly, "You are not a thing, and you are not alone." Now outside, Bryn barked once, then twice, and Cole ran to the window and saw the trees shifting like something big moved through them. And he cursed under his breath and turned to Zero and told her to hide now, and she stumbled toward the trapdoor in the floor with Bryn already standing over it like a silent guardian. Cole grabbed his rifle and pulled on his coat and stepped outside into the snow and looked around and saw nothing at first, but then a small red light blinked near the trees, then vanished, and he knew then that eyes were already on them, and time was running out. He went back inside and locked the door and looked at Zero, who now crouched in the cellar, breathing hard with Bryn beside her. And he knelt down and handed her the broken tracker and said, "We destroy this together." And she took it and placed it on the floor and crushed it with the heel of her boot, and it cracked like ice under pressure. The sound echoed through the cabin like a warning bell, and Cole looked at her and said, "We move soon, we hide better, we fight only if we must." And she nodded, and for the first time there was something in her eyes that looked like fire, not fear. Night returned fast and heavy, and the fire burned low again, and the wind howled around the cabin and far off in the trees. Something watched and waited, but inside, one man, one dog, and one alien girl had made a choice that could not be undone, and the mark on her back no longer told her story alone. The air turned sharp and still, and the cabin felt smaller than ever as the sky outside dimmed into deep gray, and Cole checked the windows again and again, while Bryn paced with ears low and tail stiff, and Zero sat close to the cellar wall with her hands gripping the edge of a blanket that no longer gave warmth, only silence and fear. Cole had seen enough to know what was coming, not a patrol, not a rescue, not a peaceful knock, but something trained, something that moved through snow without sound, something that had been told to find and erase and leave nothing behind, not even a footprint. Bryn stopped at the door and growled low and deep, and Cole whispered to Zero to stay down and grabbed his rifle and stepped to the center of the room and waited, heart steady, breath slow, and then the knock came, not soft, not hard, just cold, 3 taps that sounded like metal against wood, and he said nothing, and the knock came again. He opened the door slowly, just enough to see the figure standing outside, not human, not friendly, not even pretending it had skin, like dull steel, and eyes that glowed green, and no breath came from its mouth and no words came from its lips, and it simply stood there with one long finger pointing toward the forest, like it already knew what lay inside. Another figure stepped forward and spoke a single word in a flat voice code, and Cole replied with a shrug and said, "You got the wrong place." And the figure stepped inside without permission, and Cole raised his rifle slightly and said, "I said wrong place." And the voice repeated code. Bryn stood between the second figure and the trapdoor, with his teeth showing and his body low, and the first figure turned its head and made a sound like static, like scanning. And Cole saw its hand shift into something sharp and silver, and his finger moved near the trigger and then stopped. The second figure took 2 slow steps forward and stared at Bryn. And the dog did not move, and the figure bent lower and reached out, but Bryn snapped, and the figure pulled back and looked at Cole and said, "Strange loyalty." And Cole said, "He's a good judge." And the figure said, "Animals lie too," and turned toward the HFY. Zero stayed quiet in the cellar below, with her hands pressed over her mouth and her body frozen like stone, and her eyes locked on the trapdoor, and every breath felt like thunder, and every second stretched like wire ready to snap, and she waited for the door to open, and light to pour in, and death to follow. But Bryn barked once loud and sharp, and the first figure stopped and turned back and said nothing, and the second one tilted its head, and then both walked to the door without another word, and stepped into the snow, and vanished like ghosts into mist. And Cole waited until their shapes were gone before he let out the breath he had held. He opened the trapdoor and found Zero curled in the corner, eyes wide and skin pale, and he knelt beside her and said, "They're gone for now." And she shook her head and whispered, "No, they mark house, they tracked with scent." And Cole asked how long, and she said soon. Cole walked to the table and pulled out a cloth and opened it to reveal a small square device, no bigger than a hand, with wires and a black crystal at the center. And Zero looked at it, and her eyes narrowed, and she asked, "What is that?" And Cole smiled without joy and said, "Old gift from old war." He handed it to her and said, "I call it a noise bomb. Makes their sensors blind for 3 minutes." And she took it and held it like it might break, and then placed it beside her and said, "We use Sunan Cole nodded and said, when the next knock comes we run, not hide that night. They packed fast and light. Cole took only what he needed, and Zero found the blade she had hidden in her boot, and Bryn stayed near the door, like he knew his job better than anyone, and Cole opened the old floor hatch that led to the crawl space, and then to the frozen tunnels below, and the three of them vanished under the cabin. Just as another shadow passed by the window above the floor, the wind whispered, and the fire died, and the cabin stood still, but something watched from the trees, something with green eyes and silver hands, and it waited for no answer, because it already knew where they were going, and the hunt was not over. It had only changed shape, and far below in the cold tunnels, one man, one dog, and one broken girl moved through ice and stone with a stolen future in their hands, and the sound of boots in the snow no longer felt far away. It felt like a breath just behind them, always just behind *. The tunnels were older than memory, and colder than the wind outside, and the walls dripped with silence and frost as Cole led the way through narrow paths lit only by a dim red lamp strapped to his shoulder, and behind him Bryn moved with careful steps, and Zero followed close with her hands on the icy walls to stay upright. No one spoke, and even Bryn made no sound, and each footstep felt like thunder in the deep, and the echoes ran far ahead, like warnings to whatever still waited beyond, and Cole stopped often to check small metal pins on the wall that marked safe turns from collapsed ones, and when one was missing, he would kneel and press his ear to the ground and wait for the stone to speak. They reached an old access chamber, where rusted equipment stood silent and frozen, and Zero sat down slowly, and Cole placed his coat around her shoulders and opened a small case he had carried since the last outpost, and inside was an old transmitter, not big, not strong, but enough to call one name from a time he had buried. He tapped in the code and sent a signal, then waited with his eyes locked on the static screen, and his mind running in circles around old promises and broken years, and Zero asked softly, who? And Cole said friend or used to be, and Zero touched the screen and asked again, why not call the law? And Cole said the law had no space for people like you. Minute passed, then a line appeared on the screen, a reply, not long, not kind, just one sentence, and Cole read it twice, then 3 times, and the words dug deep into him and burned like dry snow across the skin, and Zero reached for the device, but Cole pulled it away and said not important, and she knew he was lying. She stood and stared at him, and her voice rose sharp and cold, and she asked what did they say, and Cole stayed quiet, and she stepped closer and said again louder, what did they say? And Cole finally answered, and his voice cracked a little, they said don't trust her. She is not what you think. Zero said nothing, and just looked at him, and the silence between them was louder than the wind, and Bryn let out a soft whine, as if to remind them they were still together, still breathing, still moving, and Zero turned away and picked up her blade and began to walk back toward the tunnel, and Cole stepped in front of her, and said, where are you going? She said away from you, and away from the cold and away from lies, and Cole said, I never lied, and she said, then why are your hands shaking? And Cole looked down and saw the truth, and let the transmitter fall to the floor, where it cracked open, and hissed, and the light went dark. Zero stared and said, you destroyed it, and Cole said, I did, and I would again, and she asked why, and Cole looked at her and said, because when I looked at you bleeding in the snow, I didn't see a weapon. I saw someone who needed a hand, not a bullet. Eyes softened, and she looked at Bryn, and then at Cole, and then she walked past him and sat back down and said plan, and Cole nodded, and began to draw lines on the dust of the floor with a knife tip, showing paths and tunnels and exits and dead ends, and he said, here is where we go, and here is where they will not follow. He reached into his pack and pulled out the noise bomb again and checked its wires and crystal, and said we place it here at the fork, and when it triggers it will fry their sensors for 3 minutes, and in that time we slip into the vents and crawl until we reach the other side, near the frozen river where the old shipwreck sleeps. Zara said, how do you know the ship is still there? And Cole said, because I buried it myself under stone and steel, and left it for no one else. And she asked why, and he said because I was tired of war, and she looked at him and said, then why are you still fighting? Cole looked at her and said, because this time I'm not fighting for orders or maps or flags, I'm fighting for a reason that has a name. And Zero turned her face away, but not before he saw her lips twitch just a little, just enough. The air grew colder as the moment passed, and Cole packed the map and gear and handed Zero a second coat, and Bryn led the way again, nose to the wind, ears sharp, eyes locked forward, and the tunnel opened wider now, and the dust on the floor was no longer theirs. Along tracks ran ahead, tracks that looked fresh, tracks that did not belong. 2 friends, and Cole raised his weapon and looked at Zero and said no, turning back now, and she nodded and held her blade close and whispered not anymore, and so they moved deeper into the dark, where silence was broken only by breath and the promise of something waiting beyond the bend, something that would not be fooled by smoke or tech, something that had followed them since the cabin, something that never needed to knock again. The ice cracked beneath their feet with each careful step, and the old river tunnel opened into a frozen canyon, where light slipped through broken stone, and frost hung from the ceiling, like sharp teeth waiting to fall, and Cole stopped and raised a hand, and Bryn lowered his body close to the ground, and Zero pressed her back to the wall, and whispered, "They are close," and Cole nodded once, and pointed to the rusted frame buried under snow. A headwind's not just a ship, it was a memory shaped in metal, a small scout vessel half sunk into the ice years ago, left behind by soldiers who never came back, and Cole had hidden it with rubble and silence, and now it was their last hope, and their last trap. Zero ran her hand across the frozen hull, and whispered words in her own tongue, and the ship pulsed once, with soft blue light, and Cole watched as the ice around the door melted. Just enough to open, and he turned to Bryn and said, "Stay close, no matter what," and the dog looked up and wagged his tail once, then faced the path they came from with a growl building low in his chest. Footsteps echoed through the canyon, cold and steady and not rushed and not afraid, and Cole pulled Zero inside the ship and flipped the switches he still remembered. And power flickered back to life, and systems groaned awake, and old lights blinked like tired eyes, opening after too many years, and Cole handed her the EMP device and said, "Not yet, wait for my signal outside." Shadows moved in the snow, tall and thin and silent, and they stepped into the clearing without hesitation, as if they already knew the trap, and Cole stepped out from behind the ship and raised his rifle and called out, "I have no code for you, no target for you, just one question: why chase her like a beast?" The lead figure paused, and its voice came like cracked glass. "She is not a she is property. She escaped and must be cleansed." And Cole laughed, bitter, and said, "She is more alive than you, and if you come closer, I promise none of you leave whole." And the figure said, "You cannot win." And Cole replied, "I am not here to win." Zero waited in the ship, her fingers on the trigger of the device, and her eyes on the ice, and her heart pounding as she remembered cages and needles and burning pain, and the word property echoing in her head like a curse that never left, and she whispered to herself, "Not again, not this time, not ever." Bryn barked once, loud and sharp, and the moment shattered, and Cole dove sideways, and Zero pressed the button, and the EMP exploded in silence. Only light, no sound, and the world blinked as if time stopped, and the machines stumbled as their senses went blind, and Cole fired once, not to kill, but to break the ice. The ground cracked under the machines, and the weight pulled them into the frozen river, and Zero burst from the ship and slid across the ice toward Cole, and Bryn ran beside her. And the lead figure reached for its blade, but the ice gave way, and it vanished beneath the surface with a flash of green. Cole grabbed Zero's arm and pulled her toward the ship, and Bryn jumped through the hatch just as it closed, and the ship shuddered as the engines came alive, and Zero dropped into the pilot's seat, and her hands flew across controls, and the ship lifted from the ice with wind and heat exploding outward. They broke through the stone ceiling with fire and snow, and the canyon fell behind, and the stars opened above them, cold and wide and endless, and Cole leaned back in the seat breathing hard, and Bryn sat between them and looked up with his tongue out and his tail thumping slow and steady. Zero turned to Cole, and her voice was soft and sure, and she said, "We are not done, not yet." And he smiled and said, "No, but we are not alone anymore." And she looked at Bryn and reached down and scratched behind his ear and said, "Pack," and the dog barked once and licked her hand. The ship flew through the clouds, leaving smoke and light behind, and Cole reached for the broken transmitter and tossed it out the airlock into the wind, and Zero watched it fall and said, "What now?" And Cole said, "Now we disappear, now we find a place where names are not chains and faces are not targets." And high above the world they left behind, the stars burned quiet, and the night held no judgment, and no law, and no more footsteps in the snow. Only one man, one dog, and one girl once broken. Now whole, now free, now packed forever together, against the silence of the galaxy. And somewhere far below, the ice shifted and the machines whispered, and the hunt began again, but it would be slower now. Colder now, harder now, because the prey had changed, and the rules had broken, and the dog had barked, and the human had stood, and the girl had survived, and that was enough. For now,